everything that we currently know about Mahseer, including their conservation status. But one of the key reasons for writing this paper was I talked about errors in citation networks. It was to reset the knowledge clock, but also as much to communicate how much we don't know about Mahseers and identify where the knowledge gaps were, and encourage other workers to challenge what we put in this paper and undertake their own research to help build that knowledge base. So that was the overview. We're now going to jump into the case study, which is looking at the largest of all these Mahseer species, which is the humpback Mahseer. Now, this fish was first documented by Henry Sullivan Thomas, the book I just showed you, in the Rod and India, published in 1873. And we have some images of some gigantic fish here. So we have a fish of 120 pounds, which still stands as the formal world record, caught from the River Kaveri in 1946. Fish of 110 pound from the River Kabini, a tributary of the Kaveri. Fish of 119 pound, and various other pictures of big fish from the Kaveri system, but we can't pinpoint exactly where they were from. For people not familiar with the River Kaveri, this is in South India. The river rises in the mountains of the Western Ghats, and it flows in an easterly direction for a distance of 765 kilometers before discharging into the Bay of Bengal. Quick description of what the river looks like. This is the habitat of the humpback Mahseer. It's a big river, deep pools, lots of rapids. It flows through a lot of protected forested area. In some areas, the river has a habit of throwing itself off these plateaus and forming these wonderfully spectacular waterfalls. And at one point, the entire River Kaveri barrels through this very, very narrow granite gorge, which is an incredible spectacle. And if you look on the cliff on the right hand side, you'll be able to see some people stood there. So that gives you some idea of the scale. And goodness knows how deep this gorge, the water is in this gorge. So where did it all start for me? Well, it was images like this in the angling press. So when I was a kid, occasionally the front pages of the angling press would have photographs of these gigantic fish from India. And these just blew my mind. And I promised myself a promise that I didn't ever really believe when I was a kid, but I promised myself that one day I would go to India and catch one of these fish. And eventually that dream came true. And in 2010 and 2011, I traveled to India as a recreational angler, joining a group of another 9 anglers to fish the mid-river Kaveri. Now, in the whole time I spent there, which is about 4 weeks in total over those 2 years, I didn't catch a humpback Mahseer. The only person who caught a humpback Mahseer was this guy on the left. This fish weighed 76 pounds. He had another fish of 67 pounds. None of the other anglers caught humpback Mahseer, but we weren't particularly disappointed. We all caught Mahseer, and we caught lots of them. But the Mahseer we were catching looked very different. The humpback Mahseer is characterized by its big orange fins, particularly the caudal fin, and its golden scales. The fish we were catching were more silver in appearance with strikingly blue fins. So this confused me because I'd never seen pictures of these fish before. So I spoke to the angling guides, who assured me that these were all the same fish. They're all just Mahseer. I didn't believe them. So when I got home, I got out all my books and started trying to work out what was going on. And this just left me even more confused. So this was the point where I contacted the Zoological Survey of India, and the director then put me in touch with a doctor, an ichthyologist, Dr. Remadevi, whose name will appear again in this talk, who advised me to get in touch with a Dr. Rajiv Raghavan. And Rajiv and I have been working together ever since. But when I first contacted Rajiv, he was equally confused as me as to what these species were. So it seemed like the obvious starting point was to look at the only data we had, which was to look at the records that were kept by the angling camp that I'd visited. And this is an example of one of the angling log sheets. So if we look on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see people's names, and along the top is days. Now, each day is split into two, which represents a morning session and an afternoon session. So if we look towards the top here, on Brian Cook on Saturday the 22nd caught nothing in the morning, and he caught a fish of 8 pounds in the afternoon. Now we know roughly how long each angling session was. So the anglers were fishing for 4 hours in the morning and approximately 4 hours in the afternoon. So this gave us a measure of time, which allowed us to calculate catch per unit effort. So just to summarize the scope of this data set, we recovered consistently collected data between 1998 and 2012. And over that time, a total of 23,620 hours of fishing effort were applied to catch and release over 6,000 Mahseer. Now, these fish ranged from 1 to 104 pounds in weight, so the methods being used by the anglers were not selective, size selective. But what really got my interest was the amount of detail that the anglers were recording in these forms. So if we look more closely, we'll see some fish have got a G with a red circle. That's what the anglers were calling the humpback Mahseer. They're calling them golden Mahseer. Other fish have got an S in a blue circle. That is silver Mahseer, and they were calling the bluefin Mahseer silver Mahseer. So they're recording the different phenotypes or species. We weren't sure at the time. But what this allowed us to do was separate those two groups and look at them individually and look at the catch per unit effort. So when we looked at the bluefin Mahseer, we saw from round about 2006, we see this massive acceleration in the numbers of bluefin Mahseer being caught by anglers. However, when we looked at the humpback Mahseer, we see quite the reverse. And around about the same time that the bluefin Mahseer started to escalate, we see a crash, a comprehensive crash in the numbers of humpback Mahseer being caught. So from 2005 onwards, very, very few humpbacks were being caught by anglers. And that's most powerfully summarized in relative abundance ratios. So in 1998, for every 1 humpback Mahseer being caught, there were 4 bluefin Mahseer being caught. By 2012, for every 1 humpback Mahseer being caught, there were 218 humpback Mahseer being caught. So to try and work out what was going on with the humpback Mahseer, we then plotted the individual weight of every single humpback that had been caught over that time period. So what we can see here is up to around about 2004, 2005, we have got fish ranging in weight between 1 pound and over 100 pound in weight. But when we see that corresponding with that sudden increase in the bluefin Mahseer and the crash in the humpback Mahseer, what we find is after 2006, we're not seeing any recruitment at all in the humpback Mahseer population. So what did that tell us? What were we able to conclude from this study? We could conclude that the bluefin population had exploded since 1998, and the recruitment failure in the humpback population indicated rapid extinction risk. Now, this posed a load of unanswered questions. The first of these was, which of these fish is indigenous to the River CAUVERY system? Well, because of their trophy status, anglers have always liked having their photographs taken with these fish. And we were able to unearth photographs, lots of them as well, dating back as far as 1919. And what we found, without exception, was all the early photographs showed fish with bright orange fins. They were humpback Mahseer. And it was only in the early 1990s that we started to see pictures of anglers holding Mahseer with blue fins. So this confirmed the endemic status of the humpback Mahseer, and that the bluefin Mahseer had arrived at a later time. That resulted in this publication, The Legendary Humpback Mahseer of India's River CAUVERY, an endemic fish swimming towards extinction. This is published in Endangered Species Research and was the first time that a light had been shone on the fact that this fish was in trouble. But what's important to point out here is at this point in time, in 2015, this fish still didn't have a valid scientific name, and we were still referring to it as tor species. And the implications of that was that even though we knew it was in big trouble, we couldn't get any conservation recognition for this fish. It didn't qualify for IUCN Red List assessment. The next question was, well, where did these bluefin fish come from? So we researched the history of stocking on the River Kaveri. And this book was written by the three guys who traveled to India in 1977 and 1978. And they actually drove across land all the way in a Land Rover and spent several months fishing in India. But while on their travels, they were invited by Tata to visit their Mahseer hatchery at Lonavala. And I have the book here, and there's a passage in this book that reads, "After viewing the complex of stew ponds, the doctor ordered several of them to be netted. The team was shown most examples, current Indian farm fish, as well as a special series of ponds where the breeding of the strikingly blue-finned Deccan Mahseer took place. The doctor explained that he hoped to stock the surrounding reservoirs with these fish, thus creating Mahseer waters within easy reach of Bombay." So we had a link and a clue. And then in the Wildlife Association of South India's annual journal, who controlled the fishing on the reach where our data were collected, we found this snippet: Tata's gift to Wazee. Last year, the House of Tata gifted 10,000 Mahseer fingerlings to the Wildlife Association of South India for their reserved waters in the Kaveri River. The gift was airlifted to Bangalore. Now, this is the first record that we've been able to find of many stockings which have occurred since in various parts of the Kaveri system, not just this stretch. So, okay, we knew where the fish had come from, but what were they? What species of Mahseer are we dealing with? So in 2014 and 15, we undertook expeditions to the Kaveri system, and we collected fin clips from 115 different specimens. And with the exception of one individual, the DNA sequences all matched tor khudree. They were a direct match with the fish at the fish farm at Lonavala. So we had a name at last. We knew the bluefin Mahseer were tor khudree. But I said with the exception of one fish. Sorry, we'll come on to that one. But we know that tor khudree is native to the River Krishna Basin. It was described by Sykes from the Krishna Basin. And this system is further north and has no connectivity with the Kaveri. So yes, one fish didn't match tor khudree. It had a unique DNA sequence that we'd not seen before. But when we delved into GenBank, we found 3 other sequences which matched with our fish, which were just labeled as tor species. So for reference, the red arrow here shows where the bulk of our data were collected. And on contacting the scientist who had lodged these other sequences in GenBank, I was able to find out that his samples had come from this area, which is a tributary of the Kaveri again, but this is the MOYAR system. And in 2015, I was invited by this scientist to go and see if we could find any of these fish. And this is an extremely remote area, highly protected area. This is the River MOYAR, and working with local tribal fishermen, we were successful in finding some of these fish. Fairly young fish as well, so a healthy population, sustainable population. And although I'd been interested in this particular species since I was a kid, this was the first time I'd ever actually seen one in real life, let alone got my hands on one. Now, this allowed us to collect genetic data samples and morphometric information and meristic information. And with this, we were absolutely convinced that we had a new species to science. We found that this matched with our fish from the Kaveri. and we were all ready to undertake a description. But then this paper came back to my attention. I'd seen this paper, Tortor-deep, a new species of tor from Chinnar Wildlife Sanctuary, Pambar River, Kerala, southern India. I'd never paid too much attention to this paper, largely because it lacked a lot of detail. With all due respect to the authors, the description was based on a very small sample of young juvenile fish, so less than 20 centimeters. There was no molecular analysis involved, so there was no DNA involved in this paper. It also lacked any comparison with other tor species, but it did mention the red coloration of the fins, which got alarm bells ringing. And the fact that the Pambar River is the most southerly tributary of the CAUVERY and is connected meant we realized we needed to look more carefully at this type locality of this fish. So this involved revisiting museums. Rajiv and colleagues visited museums over India and examined the type specimens of Tortor-deep. And they also, I should say, they also returned to the type locality as well and managed to find a few specimens to collect the DNA from as well, so we could link things up. So this is our fish on the right, and on the left is the output of the morphometric analysis. So what we can see is our fish from the CAUVERY, our fish from the MOYAR, and our fish from the Pambar all clustered together with Tortor-deep. When we compared those to other South Indian tor species, they were really quite distinct from tor khudree, tor kulkarni, and tor malabaricus. Again, when we looked at the phylogenetic tree, we found that our fish from CAUVERY, the fish that were collected from MOYAR, and the fish from the type locality of Tortor-deep all clustered together as a distinct grouping. So what species of Mahseer is the endemic humpback Mahseer? We had to take the name Tortor-deep. The fish had already been described. We'd missed out in that respect. But the important thing was, at last, we were able to allocate a valid scientific name to the megafauna of the CAUVERY system. I think I'd really like to hear from the authors of the Tortor-deep paper, but I think I'd be right in saying that when they described this fish, they were unaware that it was conspecific with these giants of the CAUVERY system. So this was published in PLOS 1, Resolving the Taxonomic Enigma of the Iconic Game Fish, the Humpback Mahseer of the Western Ghats Biodiversity Hotspot. So all the detail of the analysis is in this paper for those interested to take a look. And this is, again, open access and available online. So this meant we were able to really start our conservation efforts in earnest. And to cut a long story short, and various meetings with Tata about the bluefin Mahseer, they came on board and were very supportive, and we jointly launched a program named CAUVERY Mission. And this was split into two elements. The first was education and outreach, which involved visiting schools over the range states of the humpback Mahseer, so that's Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, and Kerala, and giving lessons on river conservation using the humpback Mahseer as an icon and a flagship species. We also took with us this river modeling table, allowing us to demonstrate how rivers work, how they flow, geomorphological processes, what happens if you construct a dam, what happens if you pollute a river. And this allowed the kids to get hands-on practice and get really engaged in the process. The other element of CAUVERY Mission was the field studies, and we undertook a study across the entire catchment using local fishermen to understand the distribution, the status of the humpback Mahseer and the bluefin Mahseer throughout the entire catchment. We also engaged with fish vendors using these flashcards, showing them pictures of both species, asking them which ones they encountered, and whether or not one species had disappeared or one had become more prolific. And that then allowed us to map the current distribution of the humpback Mahseer. Now, we know from historic literature that the humpback Mahseer was distributed throughout the entire River CAUVERY system historically. But now the only places the humpback Mahseer is found are the areas shaded in orange. Since drawing this map, we think we may have a small population in the Kaveri River as well. The MOYAR River population seems to be reasonably healthy, but has reduced by 50% in recent years, according to locals. But some of these other areas, like the CAUVERY, the numbers are extremely limited there now. So now the fish had a name, it also meant we were able to undertake the IUCN Red List assessment. And based on the distribution range contraction of more than 90% and the population reduction of more than 90%, as evidenced through our angler data analysis, the humpback Mahseer Tortor-deep came out as critically endangered. Now, this is the most endangered of all the tall species. And to put this into some context, other conservation icons and charismatic species like giant panda are vulnerable. The tiger, Bengali tiger, is endangered. So this fish really is on the edge. In terms of impact these fish have found their way into India's National Wildlife Action Plan. So the following actions are listed in Chapter 7, 12.2. Initiate special breeding programs for threatened fish species, such as orange-finned humpbacked Mahseer. Adequate care should be taken to prevent any genetic contamination or deterioration during these breeding and restocking programs. And undertake measures of reviving the population of native species of fish by removal of blue-finned Mahseer of the CAUVERY and exotic trout in the Himalayan rivers. So recognition that that khudree has been a factor in compromising the population health of the humpback Mahseer and the CAUVERY. In terms of current activity, we are working closely with an organisation called SHOAL, who have been very supportive. We have jointly launched Project Mahseer, which is a large umbrella project under which to cover all tall species. But the priority at the moment, our priority project, is saving the humpback Mahseer from extinction. So phase 1 has been team building and development of a conservation action plan. And Mahseer Trust and Bournemouth University have linked with the Wildlife Institute of India, Kerala University of Fisheries and Ocean Studies, and WWF. And in 2019, we undertook another scoping expedition to the MOYAR Valley and neighbouring river basins with the full support of Tamil Nadu Forest Department. And this allowed us to engage with the local village again and interview people and understand the status of the humpback Mahseer and also their relationship with the fish, how they interact with the fish when they harvest it or not. It also allowed us to look at some of the environmental challenges involved in undertaking ecology studies, specifically telemetry studies. So during the low flow periods, the MOYAR River is constricted into the main channel itself. But during monsoon, there's a whole network of channels like that you see here, which become fast-flowing turbulent streams, which is where the Mahseer are likely to spawn. So here we were looking at the logistics of sighting receivers to follow fish that have been tagged. Other environmental challenges, wildlife. These areas have very, very high densities of elephant, tigers, leopards, and plenty of other things that can give you a nasty nip. The landscape itself as well is incredibly challenging environment to work in. This photograph is looking down into the MOYAR Valley, which is completely inaccessible and remains pretty much unexplored. even downstream of here, where we managed to find the fish, it involves a very long hike to get to these places. There's no vehicular access. It's a long hike through the jungle and through all the wildlife as well. So where are we going next with the humpback research and recovery plan? Well, at present, we're undertaking catchment-wide genetic and biometric studies, so looking at the growth of these fish, the life history dynamics of these fish, the gonad development, fecundity, etc. We're also using stakeholder questionnaire surveys as well, again, to understand human interactions with the fish at different local levels. We're then planning to undertake a telemetry study to define the temporal and spatial ecology, including the critical functional habitats, specifically the spawning habitats and nursery habitats of humpback mahseer. And then, based on the findings of this information, which is critical for the next phase, we will be scoping the conservation value of assisted propagation. So plenty of people jump to the assumption that breeding is the only answer in terms of restoring populations. That's not always the case. There's usually many reasons why a species is in trouble, and trying to fix the problems at source is often a better way of doing things. So we'll be scoping the conservation value of assisted propagation, and if we decide that's the way to go, we'll then be looking at hatchery design requirements. That would be followed by initiation of assisted breeding programs and the strategic stocking and monitoring of performance of those stocks, in line with IUCN best practice guidance. So just to start summing up, and we'll go back to the genus level now. So we have one species which is critically endangered. That's our humpback mahseer, Tortor-deep. There are two species listed as endangered, which is Tortor and Malabaricus. One species, Torsinensis, is vulnerable. 3 species, Torbaraceae, Eta, and Dongienensis, are near threatened. But we have 8 species which are considered data deficient: Colcani, Mosul, Tortor, Tortambra, Tambroides, Lateritatus, Polylepis, and Yingianensis. Now, in pretty much all these cases, the reason for these 8 fish being data deficient is taxonomic uncertainty. So there's still a great deal of work to do. And these fish, once we've been able to clarify what they are in the distribution ranges, we may well find that some of these species may already be extinct or may be endangered or critically endangered. There's one fish not listed on that last list, and that is khudree. And the reason for that is it was endangered, but it's very recently been reassessed as least concern. But this is based on a number of assumptions. The first of these is, well, it's based on the fact that this fish is now widespread due to stocking programs. But the original description by Sykes in 1839 stated that khudree had fins of blood red coloration. The fish on the left that I've been showing you with blue fins clearly doesn't have red fins. So is this even the same fish? The reassessment also considered the fish of Sri Lanka, which we see on the right-hand side, to be conspecific with khudree as well. But we can see here, the fish on the right is a very different looking fish that we're finding in Sri Lanka. So are these fish the same species, or do we have other species to describe here? One other important example as well, and a priority area that needs resolving, is Tortor. So this is the type species of the genus, the deep-bodied red-finned mahseer described by Hamilton in 1822. Now, the specimen you see here is from the Narmada, which is a west-flowing river in central India. But the species was actually described from the Mahananda River in northeast Bengal in 1822. So on the map, the yellow shows you the distribution of Tortor, and the star shows you the type locality. It's currently considered to be the most widely distributed of all Tor species. But Here we have a fish from the Himalayas, the West Ramganga, also known as tortor, which looks very different. Here's another fish from the River Ken, which is a southern tributary of the River Ganges, which flows in an easterly direction. Again, a different looking fish. Here's a fish from the River Trishuli in Nepal, again, a tributary of the Ganges, but again, a very different looking fish. So these assumptions of conspecificity require urgent validation. Is there more than one species here? And if the distribution range of tortor isn't as extensive as the map I just showed you, then some of these fish have got a much more restricted range and need to be reassessed on the IUCN Red List so we can prioritize where our conservation efforts are best put. And it's because of this taxonomic uncertainty that tortor is now listed as data deficient. So some take-home messages. Robust ichthyotaxonomy requires a multidisciplinary approach involving morphometrics and meuristics, molecular tools, the use of historic literature, historic photographs. Don't underestimate the importance of stakeholder input as demonstrated by the angling data. And the most important thing, and I just caught the very end of Rowan's talk, and he made this point as well, but collaboration is the key. Don't try, taxonomy isn't a competition, or it shouldn't be a competition. Good taxonomy should involve the engagement of experts across broad fields to get the most robust descriptions and outcomes. I'll just finish off with one question that I often get asked, because we used Angler data to do this study, and anglers have played an important role in the conservation of these fish in many areas. I'm often asked, is angling compatible with conservation, particularly when you're advocating angling for a critically endangered fish? Well, it's a very good question, and I'm not saying that I have the answer, but one consideration is, had it not been for the structured and detailed long-term records kept by anglers, the world's largest Mahseer may have gone extinct without ever having been recognized as a valid species. So I'm going to leave it there, say thank you. I'm going to leave you with a picture of a wonderful, gorgeous humpback Mahseer surrounded by lots of other pictures of other gorgeous Mahseers, and just a plea to encourage people to work on these fish and help us fill the knowledge gaps. So thank you very much indeed.